discussion today to be discussed with all of you, basically on the IFE standards and Shari'ah consideration in the structuring Sukuk. Of course, there are a lot of discussion so far has been emphasizing and repeatedly discussing on the pronouncement by IFE, which is not new. Basically what has been said in February 2008 is just a reiteration of what has been there in the IFE standard, and it is basically embedded in the Shari'ah principle. That's why I will be going to touch on this a little bit. That's why my presentation will be of two parts. First, I will touch a little bit on the basic Shari'ah principle that you have to understand in structuring not only Sukuk but also any financial product. And of course, then only I will touch the IFE standard, because for me, in order for you to appreciate the pronouncement made by the IFE with regards to the Sukuk structuring, it is important for us to also understand what are the basic principles underlying the whole financial transaction. Basically, just very quickly, the major components of financial services. What we discussed today is more on the equity and Islamic securities. We are not touching on the financing part so much, deposit, investment. Yesterday, Dr. Dar has mentioned a little bit on structuring deposit product and investment product. But of course, these are an overview of the major components of financial services, which, to my knowledge, only Malaysia has this comprehensive Islamic financial services, which comprising of banking, capital market, as well as takaful or the Islamic insurance. So what is Sukuk? I don't have to go into detail because has been mentioned by Mohammed Ismail yesterday and discussed further by Richard just now. Basically, the most important thing, if you look at the IFE standard number 17, the definition of Sukuk basically is an investment Sukuk which has certificates of equal value representing undivided shares in ownership of tangible assets, usufructs and services in the ownership of the assets of particular projects of special investment activity. However, it is true after receipt of the value of the Sukuk, the closing of subscription and the employment of funds received for the purpose of which the Sukuk were issued. So if you look at the definition of investment Sukuk, it comprising of various types of underlying assets that you can actually use for structuring Sukuk, either tangible assets, usufruct, services, assets of particular project or special investment activities. But interestingly, IFE does not recognize receivables or debt receivables for the underlying assets. Essentially because we are talking about IFE as a minimum standard which is universally accepted by all jurisdictions, which sale of debt in particular is not something which is considered permissible transaction. Even though if we are talking about Southeast Asia like Malaysia, Brunei, and not to say Indonesia, but limited to Malaysia, Brunei and Singapore, they basically recognize sale of debt as the something which is not prohibited, which I will explain to you a little bit in brief. Okay, so the basic structure of Sukuk, I don't have to go into details. But if you look at the basis for Sukuk classification, it can be based on the underlying contracts in the Sukuk structures, either sales-based, lease-based, partnership-based or agency-based. These are the prominent Islamic contracts used in structuring Sukuk. Or it can be also classified as in, the technical and commercial features of the Sukuk itself, either asset-based, the normal one, or asset-backed, ABS, or even hybrid structure, which has already been discussed by Richard just now, or the nature and the type of asset represented by the Sukuk, either debt-based, tangible assets, usufruct, rights of investment projects, special investment activities. These are the general classification that you have to understand, because when structuring Sukuk, it depends on how you basically, the objective of the obligor or the issuer. Basically looking at the assets type or asset classes that they are having. So basically these are some of the consideration that you will take. So types of Sukuk, okay, as I mentioned just now, can be classified either asset-based, asset-backed or hybrid. Again, under asset base, it can be either sales base, lease base, partnership base, or agency base. These are the common contracts that has been used so far. Okay, in Malaysia, BBA, Baik Bertaman Ajil, deferred payment sales. Okay, someone asked me what's the difference between BBA and Baik Muajjal as practiced in Pakistan. It is basically the same. Basically, BBA is not a contract. I need to emphasize this because BBA is just a method of payment. Okay, it can be either based on murabah, cost plus sale, or based on musawamah, as mentioned by Richard just now, where you do not know the cost element of the pricing. So if you do not know the cost, you just determine whatever price, that is called musawamah. But if you know the cost price and you just put a markup on top of the cost price, that is basically murabah. And murabah or musawamah can be either paid on spot or on deferred. If it is paid on deferred, that's why it is called BBA, Baik Bertaman Ajil. Baik means sales, Bertaman means price, Ajal means deferred. So Baik Muajjal is sales on deferred basis. So it's very similar. But when we talk about BBA in the context of Malaysia, it basically refers to INA, sale and buyback. There is a common understanding. That's why if it is not INA, normally banks will refer it as a normal murabah contract. But also some of the institutions, they classify murabah as a short-term, BBA as a long-term contract. But in essence, if you are talking about BBA contract in the context of Malaysia, it is actually a sale and buyback, which is Bai'ul INA, which is the most controversial contract in Islamic finance. Other than that, sales base, it's a murabah, salam istisna. Salam istisna is not that popular unless it is structured together with other types of contract in the form of hybrid instrument, like the one that Richard has mentioned earlier, the tabrik, sukuk for example. It is a combination of istisna and other types of contract. And for salam, Bahrain Monetary Agency has issued this for liquidity purposes. So these are some of the sales base. Ijarah or lease base, it can be either ijarah, just plain vanilla ijarah, lease contract, or ijarah muntahiyah bitamlik, where you have leasing ending with transfer of ownership. It depends on how you transfer of ownership. Either you want to execute another sales contract, or you just treat it as a form of hibah or gift. That can also be considered. Or the new one, which is currently gaining more acceptance and popularity in structuring sukuk, mainly because most of the structure, they want to replicate the conventional sense, in the sense that bank or issuer, normally they want to achieve a certain consistency in terms of income stream generation. So they will use ijarah mausufah fi zimmah, or in English term, it is basically a forward lease. So forward lease is very similar to salam, a forward sale, meaning that in terms of condition, in terms of rules and regulation, it basically take the ruling of Bai'ul Salam, meaning that you have to specify what are the description of the asset and so on. And whatever payment received in advance, it's considered in advance. It cannot be recognized as income. Okay, that is basically from the accounting point of view, as well as even if you look at some of the jurisdiction, like in Malaysia, they have just recently issued parameters for ijarah contract. It is mentioned clearly in the parameter, in the guideline, that income accrued, okay, or basically whatever payment of rental that you receive throughout the duration of ijarah mausufah fi zimmah cannot be recognized as income. So if, for example, the project is abandoned, so you have to return the whole amount to the lessee who has paid in advance for the future usufruct, which is not actually realized. All right. Besides that, of course, mudarabah and musyarakah. This is the main issues that IFE basically mentioned about purchase undertaking, because in essence, okay, you cannot guarantee profits nor capital. So this is a very basic principle in Islamic investment, where you cannot guarantee principal nor profit. So because you want to replicate the conventional structure, you have the purchase undertaking to redeem at par. So all these are some of the issues that we are going to discuss. Wakalah bi-istismar is an agency contract where you delegate or you appoint an agent to do your investment. So the ruling for wakalah bi-istismar or agency for the purpose of investment is similar like a mudarabah and musyarakah. That's why in the IOFI it is mentioned very clearly. Okay, it is if the sukuk is structured based on mudarabah, musyarakah, or wakalah. What is meant by wakalah in that sense is basically wakalah bi-istismar for investment purposes. So you cannot guarantee. The agent cannot guarantee anything. Alright. So besides that, you have the hybrid structure. Alright. So the very important aspect that you need to understand in structuring or innovating Islamic product, you have to go back to the theory of contract. Because the basic theory of contract says that any transfer of wealth or property has to be made through a valid contract. I repeat, any transfer of wealth or property must be made through a valid contract. In Islam, validity of contract is very important. That's why, even though purchase undertaking is used, purchase undertaking is just a purchase undertaking. It's just a warrant. It is not a contract. Okay, that's why one question you mentioned, you were asking about, is there any gharar in warrant? There's no gharar in warrant because gharar only happens in a bilateral contract, in a contract. Whereas purchase undertaking is not a contract. It's just simply a warrant, undertaking, a promise. So that's why, even though you have a purchase undertaking to enter into a contract, okay, for example, to enter into the contract in future. So, from the Shari'ah perspective, okay, the transaction only happen in future when you actually sign and execute the contract. That's why one of the questions I asked Hariza yesterday, whether is there any real execution of contract, because there are some instances which I have encountered certain banks in Malaysia where they just treat as the master facility as a basically as a contract, basically just to reflect the future contract as well. So you just sign in advance for everything, which is cannot be basically it is considered non-Sharia compliant, because again the issue of validity is important. Again, the validity depends on two important aspects. First, it has to be based on the divine guidance, whatever ruling that has been outlined in the Quran as well as mentioned in the Hadith. So that's why all the contract that we have seen so far in structuring sukuk, it has its own ruling to ensure its validity. Okay, and equally important is the mutual consent, the rida. Both parties must have a mutual consent. But in Islam, mutual consent alone is not sufficient. Okay, mutual consent alone is not sufficient. Mutual consent must be in line with whatever guideline given by or prescribed in Shari'ah. That's why there's a popular maxim, al-mu'min ala shurutihim, illa shurtan ahalla haraman wa harrama halal. Okay, basically, Muslims or parties in the transaction are bound by their stipulation. They can stipulate whatever contract, they can construct or innovate whatever contract as both parties agree, as long as they do not actually contravene or contradicting to the very basic principle which has been clearly specified either in the Quran or in the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So this is very clear guideline for all of you to take into consideration. So that's why there is some important Sharia parameters in innovating this product, as I mentioned to you briefly yesterday. Basically, when you want to identify whether or when you want to innovate certain contracts in Islam, okay, you can even just take conventional contract, for example. But what you will do is basically to really look into the Sharia issues in the contract itself. So it is important for you to basically to screen that it will be free. The contract must be free from riba, zulm, okay, or injustices, as well as gharar. As mentioned by Dr. Dar yesterday, okay, the scholars have actually divided gharar into two: excessive gharar and tolerable gharar, gharar fahish and gharar yasir. And gharar only happens, okay, I repeat, gharar only happens in the bilateral, profit-oriented contract. Okay, it will not happen in the unilateral contract. It will not happen in the charitable contract. That's why, okay, if you have even a charitable contract, okay, let's say even in the certain instances where you want to construct issues like wakalah, for example. Wakalah can be deemed as a charitable contract as well as muawadat contract or bilateral contract. It depends on how you structure your product. Okay, so if it is structured in a form of unilateral, so there will no issue of gharar. But if it is structured in a bilateral meaning that each party has its own interest. Okay, for example, in a bilateral contract, sales, for example, I transfer ownership in return. Okay, basically, I want some consideration, basically the price. So in these instances, there is an issue of gharar that you have to take into consideration, meaning that gharar or uncertainty which may lead to dispute. That's why Shari'ah give a very clear guideline so that you will not enter into such a transaction that may lead to dispute, because one of the objectives of Shari'ah is to avoid any potential dispute among the two parties in contracting, in transaction. So these important issues, because when you look into the Sukuk issues, for example, IOFI standard or IOFI pronouncement, the issue of one party cannot grant loan if there is any deficit or any shortage of liquidity, for example. This mainly because, okay, you are basically attached the loan contract, okay, card contract with the profit-making contract. And this is basically, okay, again, it contravenes to the principle of Shari'ah, where you cannot combine loan and sales together, because it's a very clear hadith of the Prophet, Nahya an bay' wa salaf. You cannot actually combine sales contract and a loan contract, because sales contract is a bilateral contract, it's a profit-making contract, whereas loan contract is a unilateral contract, it's a charitable contract. So you cannot combine together because it has two different contradicting objectives. So the scholars basically interpret this hadith in the light of gharar, because when you enter into such a combined nature, there is a possibility of, because it has two different objectives altogether. One, sales contract, which is aimed at making profit with a certain stipulated period of time, whereas card or charitable contract, it is not basically a profit making, it is not supposed to make money out of it, because there is a basic principle saying that whenever you enter into loan contract, whatever benefit derived from a loan contract is considered riba. Kullu qardin jara naf'an fahuwa riba. Any benefit derived from a loan contract is considered riba. So all these important elements will be scrutinized by the scholars, not as simple as saying that, oh, these are the only three elements, but especially when it comes to gharar, there are different types of gharar which happens in different types of contract that you have to basically look into. Okay? And of course, element of zulm or qimar, gambling and so on. Okay? So general classification of contract in Islam, as I mentioned to you, it can be divided into two broad categories: charitable contracts and profit-making contracts. Okay? In the some of the literatures in classical text, they basically, for example, Ibn Hazm, he basically divide the discussion of the scholars in the Islamic contracts into two. He said that, okay, more than 80% of the discussion of the scholars have been in the profit-making contract. Only 20% are on the charitable contract. And in fact, in Islam, the charitable contracts are not that many. Can you give me an example besides loan that I have mentioned to you? Anything that you know? Charitable contracts in Islam?
Gift.
A gift, hibah. What else?
Kafala.
Kafala, zakah, sadaqah, charity. Okay, all these are charitable contract. But profit-making contracts, it can be in the form of exchange contract, mu'awadat contract, or cooperation contract, or mu'awanat contract. So gharar only happens in exchange contract. It will not happen in basically charitable contract, because the objective is to make charity. There is no consideration. A person who gives a hibah, for example, okay, you cannot sue him for not fulfilling his obligation or fulfilling his promise to give you some gift. For example, at the end of this workshop, let's say Shafiq promised you to give you a token of some appreciation, let's say £10 each. But at the end of the period, no one received anything. You sue Shafiq. You cannot sue anything because it's a charitable contract. It's a unilateral contract. It's up to Shafiq whether he wants to give or not to give. So in charitable contract, there is no possibility of dispute. Whereas in profit-making contract, it's clear. There are a lot of rooms for dispute. That's why there are a lot of contracts that is used currently in Islamic banking, Islamic finance, especially when you want to structure, okay, either based on plain vanilla contract, sales, lease, or even the hybrid contract. But more importantly, today, we have this element of purchase or promise undertaking, which is attached to most of these contracts. Alright? So let us look at some of the IOFI guidelines. Okay, basically IOFI has outlined when it comes to Sukuk 3 important issues, especially first in terms of primary issuance. When you want to issue, what are the contracts that need to be used and what are the consideration in each of the contract. Second, on the issue of tradability of Sukuk. This is also one of the important. Okay, I'm not talking about the pronouncement, I'm talking about the IOFI standard. Okay, as well as the redemption of Sukuk. Okay, it has been clearly outlined by IOFI. In addition to this, okay, other sections or other standard in the IOFI basically discuss also about the issue of amalgamation of contracts or combination of contract. Or in Arabic, it is mentioned in the IOFI standard as al-jam'u bain al-uqud. When you want to combine a contract. Okay, this is something which is very fundamental because okay, you have seen so far since yesterday there are a lot of combination of contract takes place in innovating or structuring Islamic finance. So what are the parameters, what are the minimum requirement? IOFI has set a very clear guideline. Okay, first, you can actually combine contract, okay, but you have to ensure the first ruling is that you cannot combine loan and sales. Okay, because there is a very clear textual or divine guideline on that. Okay, you have a question? No. Okay, first, you cannot actually combine contract which is clearly prescribed in the hadith which prohibit you from combining it, especially loan and sales contract. What about hadith which mention about you cannot enter into 2 sales in 1 sales, bay'atan fi bay'ah or safqatan fi safqah? Okay? These are hadiths which is still disputable in terms of its originality, okay, its authenticity. Okay, so the scholars basically differ in terms of opinion. How authentic is it? But their difference of opinion mainly in 2 respects. First, the authenticity of the hadith itself. Second, on the meaning of the hadith. Okay, basically, even in the IOFI standard, it outlines that the meaning of the combination 2 sales contract into 1 sales contract basically to avoid gharar, uncertainty, and basically because of this disputable element, IOFI says that you can still combine, okay, 2 sales in 1 sales as long as the most important thing, the essence or the meaning of this hadith, you cannot actually have, okay, 1 contract where it has a conditional upon to another contract. Okay, meaning that you have a condition, okay, in the contract which will have an effect to another contract or conditional sales contract. This is very clear. That's why in IOFI, okay, the second important consideration in amalgamation of contract or hybrid contract, okay, the execution of the contract, okay, must be done separately. Okay, the issue of uqud mustaqillah, the independent of the contract must be taken into account. Meaning that even though you combine all contracts together, it is basically a combination in the form of 1 whole transaction. But when it comes to execution of the contract, okay, you have to execute it separately. Okay, for example, you can see in Sukuk yesterday, you combine mudarabah, you combine istisna together, you combine sales, 1 sales, another sales, istisna, or in many contract, you can see a lot of combination of contract. Commodity murabah in essence is actually a combination of 2-3 sales contract which combine actually in 1 form of transaction. But in essence, it is executed separately and each contract will be seen as a separate contract. That's why if you look at the discussion of the scholars, even when they give a guideline in structuring all this Islamic swap, profit rate swap, which Dr. Dow will be explaining to us tomorrow, basically it's very clear. Each contract must be a real contract. Okay, it has to be independent and real contract, meaning that it is not a fictitious contract. Fictitious means you just assume that you have this series of murabah, but in actual effect, you did not actually sign or execute the contract, or there is no real transfer of ownership, like in case of the organized tawarruk, which has become a polemic recently. Right? So these are some of the issue of amalgamation of contract as well as the issue of execution of contract. This has been clearly outlined by IFE in terms of not only in terms of Sukuk but also in terms of other structuring products of Islamic finance.